It began, as many tragedies do, without warning. A Monday that was supposed to be ordinary turned into the first day of a harrowing mystery. A woman vanished, no screams, no signs of struggle, no final goodbyes. She was simply gone. Janine Camerata was not a name known outside her Staten Island neighborhood. To most, she was a quiet elementary school teacher, the kind who stayed after class to organize art supplies or help a student catch up on reading. At home, she was a mother of three, balancing parenting and part-time jobs while navigating the complexities of a recent separation. Nothing in her background suggested she would be the subject of a police search, let alone a homicide investigation. But something about her disappearance was immediately unsettling. She had never missed work without notice. She answered her phone, replied to messages, and kept in close contact with friends and family. For Janine to vanish without a word was not just out of character, it was impossible to ignore. Her car was still parked outside her apartment. Her phone had been left behind. Her bed was made, dishes untouched, a cup of coffee half full and cold on the counter. The door was locked from the outside. There were no broken windows, no sign of forced entry, but also no sign that she had chosen to leave. The people closest to her were the first to feel the alarm. A colleague noticed she hadn't checked in about the lesson plan for the next day. A friend called multiple times without answer. Her family grew anxious as hours passed. And then there was her ex-husband, who said he hadn't seen her in days, though they shared custody of the children and were due in family court soon for a custody hearing. From the outside, there was nothing to suggest that Staten Island had just become the center of a chilling crime. But for those who knew Janine, that quiet disappearance echoed like a scream. Law enforcement didn't delay. When a mother of three vanishes, especially during a contentious divorce, the risk factors multiply. The missing person squad was contacted. Detectives began a timeline. The last confirmed sighting of Janine was that weekend. She was reportedly on her way to meet someone, though who exactly that was remained unclear. Officers canvassed the area, checking traffic cameras, knocking on neighbors' doors, reviewing social media. No immediate threats emerged, but the more they searched, the more they were disturbed by what they didn't find. There were no calls to 911, no financial activity on her cards, no messages sent from her accounts, not even a post on Facebook, which Janine used frequently to share updates about her kids. Her digital life had gone silent, and in this age, that silence was damning. Suspicion quietly began to creep in. In many missing person cases, time is the enemy. The first 24 to 48 hours often determine whether a case can be solved swiftly or not at all. Here, hours turned into days. Search parties formed, flyers were printed, friends pleaded online for help. The community began to stir. How could a woman vanish in the middle of the city without anyone noticing? There was no evidence of a break-in, no blood, no distress. But that was what made it worse. She hadn't just gone missing. She had been erased. The investigation's early steps revealed a web of complicated personal dynamics. Janine had been in the midst of a volatile divorce from her husband, a man described by some as charming, by others as controlling. Court records showed recent disputes over custody, with allegations of verbal and emotional abuse. Janine had confided in close friends that she felt watched, even threatened, though she never reported any of it formally. Still, there was no proof of foul play. Not yet. Just a growing sense that something was wrong. Deeply wrong. At this stage, detectives were cautious. They couldn't label it a homicide without a body. They couldn't accuse without evidence. But every empty room in Janine's apartment whispered the same thing. She hadn't left of her own will. The final straw came when investigators reviewed local security footage and caught a glimpse of something odd. A vehicle not registered to Janine, pulling away from the vicinity of her residence late at night. No headlights, no clear plate, just a silhouette in the dark. It wasn't enough to make an arrest, but it was enough to widen the net. Soon, what began as a disappearance would evolve into something darker, and what had seemed like a tragic mystery would soon reveal itself as a calculated act of brutality. But for now, all anyone knew was that Janine Camerata, teacher, mother, friend, was missing, and the clock was ticking. Before she became a missing person, Janine Camerata was a woman navigating the quiet but often unrelenting turbulence of modern life. There were no headlines when she left work a little late, no cameras when she picked up her kids, no news crews filming as she sat alone at night, worried about bills, court dates, or the constant weight of trying to do everything right while feeling that something was always about to go wrong. She was, by all accounts ordinary, and that is what makes her story so profoundly unsettling. Janine was the kind of person whose absence was immediately noticed, not because she sought attention, but because her presence was dependable. In the classroom, she was patient, attentive, and nurturing. Her colleagues described her as someone who brought snacks for the team, who stayed behind to clean up craft messes without being asked. Her students remembered her as gentle. In life, she was not loud, but she mattered. And when someone like that disappears, the void they leave is immediate and vast. Her world, however, was not without stress. Janine was in the midst of a complicated divorce, entangled in a custody dispute that had already turned bitter. Family court proceedings had become routine, and every meeting seemed to escalate rather than resolve. Friends close to her said she often seemed exhausted, not just physically but emotionally drained by the pressure of having to prove she was a fit parent, all while trying to maintain some kind of normal life for her children. The legal proceedings surrounding her separation were more than paperwork. They were reminders of a relationship that had shifted from love to tension, from comfort to control. According to sources later interviewed in the investigation, Janine had once described her former spouse as someone who became increasingly possessive, monitoring her movements and questioning her decisions. She rarely spoke about it publicly, perhaps out of fear, or a belief that no one would take her seriously. But in text messages to close friends, a different narrative emerged, one that suggested she felt increasingly cornered, watched, and unheard. Janine never filed formal charges for abuse. There were no restraining orders, no police reports to document fear. But fear doesn't always come with evidence. Often it lives in the subtle changes, a quieter tone, the way someone double-checks a locked door, or the look in their eyes when asked, "Are you okay?" The silence in official records is not proof that nothing happened. It is too often proof that victims knew nothing would be done if they spoke. The timeline before her disappearance, when reviewed later by investigators, revealed the kind of detail that only becomes significant in hindsight. Her court hearing regarding custody was approaching. She had recently expressed concern that she was being followed. A friend recalled her mentioning an argument that had left her shaken. But there were no reports, no interventions, just worry, and a woman trying to manage a fragile peace. Her children were at the center of her life. She worked multiple jobs to support them, never missed a school meeting, and made every effort to provide a sense of normalcy despite the strain of separation. She didn't take vacations. She didn't go out late. Her phone was always on, which is why the silence that followed her disappearance was more than concerning. It was incompatible with who she was. In cases like these, profiling plays a critical role, not just of potential suspects, but of the victim, who they were, what mattered to them, what they feared, what routines they followed. These details help build a portrait not of what happened, but of what should have happened, had nothing gone wrong. Janine's life was, in many ways, predictable, structured. That predictability made any deviation stand out. Investigators dug into her recent activity. No withdrawals from her bank account, no use of public transportation. Her phone left behind contained unsent messages. A draft email on her laptop, never sent, expressed anxiety over custody issues and mentioned feeling watched constantly. Again, no accusation, just an echo of distress, enough to suggest that her vanishing wasn't impulsive. It became clear early in the investigation that Janine wasn't someone who would disappear voluntarily. The notion that she might have left town, abandoned her children, or run off was not supported by any behavior in her history. She had appointments scheduled, a court date marked, her rent was paid. She had left food in the fridge for the next day. There were no signs of premeditation, at least not on her part. Meanwhile, detectives began conducting interviews. Friends, co-workers, neighbors, and especially those close to her in recent weeks. Everyone was asked the same question. When was the last time you saw Janine? And did anything feel off? A pattern started to form. In the days leading up to her disappearance, Janine had seemed distracted. One friend described her as nervous but trying to hide it. Another said she was considering filing for full custody but was afraid of the confrontation it might provoke. And then there were the messages, brief, vague, and disjointed, sent just before she vanished. They were uncharacteristically flat in tone, as if someone else had written them, or she had been under pressure. The person who knew Janine best, her sister, told detectives she had never heard her so fearful. She didn't say it directly, she recounted, but it was like she was bracing for something. None of these pieces alone meant anything conclusive, but together they formed a chilling outline, a woman in distress, caught in a legal battle, quietly communicating fear, and then disappearing without a sound. The question that loomed over the investigation wasn't just where she had gone, it was who might have benefited from her absence, and what steps they may have taken to ensure she didn't come back. In criminal investigations, especially those involving domestic connections, the truth often hides in the gaps between perception and reality. Janine's life, on the surface, was that of a devoted mother and hardworking teacher. But underneath, the pressure had been building for months, perhaps even years. And now, the woman who had spent her days protecting others needed someone to fight for her. By the third day, the atmosphere within the investigation team had shifted from procedural concern to controlled urgency. What had begun as a missing persons report was now on the cusp of being treated as a probable crime, not because there was blood, not because a suspect had been identified, but because every hour that passed without a trace of Janine Camerata only added weight to the possibility that she would not be coming back. Detectives assigned to the case were experienced. They had seen enough to understand that when a person disappears without financial activity, digital communication, or sightings, especially someone with deep roots in her local routine, foul play must be considered early. Waiting for confirmation often meant losing time. In homicide investigations, time rarely gives anything back. It only takes. The search started with the familiar. Janine's apartment was examined again, this time with greater intensity. Forensics collected items that at first glance had seemed irrelevant: door handles, the underside of drawers, strands of hair in the bathroom sink. The absence of chaos became suspicious in itself. The space was too clean. There was no struggle, no overturned furniture, not even an out-of-place coffee cup, except for one half-empty mug on the counter, cold, left behind, as though she had been interrupted mid-thought. It was subtle, but for investigators who had walked through dozens of similar cases, it wasn't nothing. The investigators then turned to the building's exterior. A review of nearby security footage was launched, a task that often yields more frustration than revelation. The grainy clips, often poorly lit or motion-triggered, can be tedious to examine, but in Janine's case, they provided the first tangible shift in the trajectory of the investigation. A camera from a nearby store captured a vehicle, one not registered to Janine or any known associate, pulling into the area late at night, close to the time she was believed to have last been seen. The vehicle stayed less than 10 minutes, headlights off. The footage didn't provide license plates, but it did reveal a partial silhouette of someone in the driver's seat. The timing, coupled with the location, made it more than a coincidence. While that alone couldn't confirm anything, it provided a thread, one that needed to be pulled carefully, because if there was someone out there involved in her disappearance, they now had a window of action. Investigators flagged the vehicle and began scouring DMV records for matches. At the same time, they broadened their request for surveillance footage, including from gas stations, toll booths, and traffic intersections within a 5-mile radius. Digital forensics took on a central role next. Janine's phone, while left behind, still held pieces of her final hours in the form of location data, draft messages, and metadata from her most used apps. One draft message stood out. It wasn't saved intentionally, but retrieved from temporary memory, a half-written sentence expressing concern about someone trying to take the kids away. It ended abruptly, as though it had been stopped mid-typing. It was time-stamped within a narrow window before her disappearance. Investigators also obtained her cell provider's triangulation data. While the phone itself had not moved, other devices, those belonging to individuals connected to her, were reviewed. One, in particular, showed movement consistent with the unknown vehicle caught on camera. It wasn't conclusive yet, but a geographic overlap was beginning to emerge. The people closest to Janine were interviewed in greater detail. Friends described her as increasingly stressed in the days leading up to her disappearance. She had expressed anxiety about her legal battles, but more than that, she had begun to act like someone watching over her shoulder. She didn't say she was being followed, one said, but she did things like change her route home for no reason. That behavior, minor as it seemed, pointed towards someone under low-grade, ongoing pressure. Those kinds of behaviors rarely leave physical evidence, but they're crucial in building psychological context. Victims who fear someone enough to alter routines are not doing so for nothing. They are adapting, often silently, to survive. While the inner circle of family and close friends painted a portrait of a woman on edge, trying to keep her life intact, others offered a different shade. A colleague, under condition of anonymity, mentioned a recent conversation where Janine seemed hesitant to discuss her ex-spouse, only saying, "He knows how to make things hard without ever getting caught." The quote lingered in the minds of the investigators, not because it accused anyone, but because it suggested manipulation rather than overt aggression. And that is far harder to track. At this stage, the detectives adopted a dual strategy: continue gathering hard evidence while subtly applying pressure through interviews. In cases involving domestic disputes, perpetrators often rely on emotional proximity to mask their actions. They assume law enforcement won't look too closely at what appears to be internal family turmoil. But in reality, those closest to the victim are often the first to be questioned and the last to be ruled out. The detectives followed up with known associates, including individuals with shared custody or legal disputes. Each was asked for alibis, phone records, and details about their last interaction with Janine. Some were cooperative, others guarded. One person, whose connection to Janine was once intimate but had since grown strained, claimed to have had no contact with her in days. The statement seemed plausible at first, but when cross-referenced with phone tower data and a neighbor's account of seeing a figure outside her building late at night, inconsistencies began to surface. Meanwhile, attention turned to a storage facility located on the outskirts of Staten Island. Records showed that a unit had been rented recently by someone with indirect links to Janine's social circle. It had been accessed late at night, within a day of her disappearance. The coincidence was too direct to ignore. Investigators made arrangements to gain access to the unit. They did not expect what they would find, but before that door was open, before the forensic team arrived in full gear, before Janine's name became the center of a tragic headline, there was still one small, fleeting hope: that perhaps she was alive, somewhere, waiting. That hope, like the light from the storage facility's flickering exterior bulb, was fading quickly. It was early morning when the crime scene unit arrived at the self-storage facility just off a quiet service road in Staten Island. The building stood low and nondescript, designed to be anonymous, rows of metal roll-up doors and fluorescent lighting casting a pale glare over the concrete lot. Nothing about it screamed urgency or danger, but the quiet was deceptive. Some of the darkest truths are hidden in the most unremarkable places. Room 17B, the unit in question, had been rented under a name unfamiliar to Janine Camerata's family or close friends. The name was not random, but it took cross-referencing DMV databases and phone records to trace it back to someone whose presence in her life was far more complicated than the paperwork suggested. The timestamp on the entry logs aligned too perfectly with the narrowing window of her disappearance. The frequency of visits, the time of night, and the brief durations each time, it was behavior that didn't fit any pattern of normal use. When the officers first opened the unit, the stench hit them before the door fully lifted. The interior was dim and oppressively still. The smell, chemical, acidic, layered with something far worse, was immediate and unmistakable. Death has a scent that no one forgets after the first time they encounter it. It clings to the walls, to clothing, to memory. It warns even before the eyes confirm what the nose already knows. Inside, tucked behind a stack of old furniture and boxes, was a large black trash bag. It wasn't hidden, not really, just obscured by disorganization. One of the detectives later noted that it seemed hastily placed, not with intent to preserve or bury, but merely to delay discovery. That choice, of location, of concealment, said something about the perpetrator: not meticulous, desperate, trying to control time, not truth. When the bag was carefully opened, it revealed what they had feared: human remains, burned, disfigured, partially melted into the plastic. Forensic investigators began immediate documentation, each photo a permanent record of a moment that should never have existed. The body inside was that of a woman, small in frame, severely burned, and placed in a crouched position as though forcibly compressed. There were no identifying items on her, no clothing intact, no jewelry. They couldn't confirm identity immediately. The level of damage from heat and decomposition removed all obvious markers, but investigators already knew who it most likely was. Back at the lab, the medical examiner began the process of confirming what law enforcement suspected. The first step was dental comparison. Janine had dental records on file due to a past accident, a small blessing in a moment so grim. Within 48 hours, identity was officially confirmed: Janine Camerata. The cause of death was not the fire. It was blunt force trauma to the head. She had been struck, hard, repeatedly, before any attempt was made to destroy the body. The fire had been a cover, not a weapon. The autopsy also revealed fractured ribs, bruising consistent with defensive wounds, and injuries to her face and hands, suggesting a struggle. There was something particularly cruel about the setting in which she was found. Storage units are meant for things we want to put away, things that don't fit in our homes, but we can't quite throw out. In death, Janine had been treated like an object, stuffed into a dark corner, shut behind metal and lock, as though her life could be boxed up and forgotten. It's hard to quantify the emotional impact these discoveries have on investigators. Many of them compartmentalize, they have to. But Janine's case touched a raw nerve, not just because of the brutality, but because of the humanity she embodied. A schoolteacher, a mother, a woman already burdened by life's strain ended in such indignity. There's something particularly offensive to the moral order when someone like that is silenced, discarded, and burned. Once the remains were identified, detectives accelerated their interviews and evidence gathering. The person who had rented the unit was questioned. Their demeanor was calm, almost too calm. Their statement was procedural. They denied involvement, claimed ignorance, offered alibis. But technology again told a different story. Surveillance footage from the storage facility showed a vehicle entering and exiting within a tight time frame during the night of Janine's disappearance. The person seen on the camera entering the facility wore gloves and a hood, but their gait, body shape, and even footwear matched that of the individual under scrutiny. Forensic testing of the bag and the remains revealed trace DNA and hair strands not belonging to Janine. The killer had made mistakes. The gloves had not prevented all transfer, the car used had not been properly cleaned, and perhaps most significantly, the phone location data matched every movement recorded on camera, down to the minute. In the language of investigations, this was convergence. Multiple data sources aligning independently, each strengthening the other. Meanwhile, Janine's family was informed of the discovery. The news shattered whatever hope had remained. Grief does not come cleanly in such cases. It arrives with rage, with confusion, with guilt. Her children were too young to understand. Her loved ones could only begin to grasp the depth of what had happened. But amid the mourning, the case moved forward. With a confirmed homicide, law enforcement could now act with greater authority. Search warrants, phone seizures, digital account access. They began connecting communication logs between individuals who had contact with Janine in her final hours. Some messages had been deleted but were recovered through subpoenaed data. Others had been disguised through secondary accounts, but investigators knew how to follow breadcrumbs. Each new layer pulled back suggested a plan, not a spur-of-the-moment crime of passion, but something more deliberate. Yet even deliberate crimes leave space for human error. And in Janine's case, that error would prove fatal for the one who had taken her life. By the time forensic confirmation of Janine Camerata's identity had been made, the trajectory of the investigation shifted dramatically. No longer a question of whether a crime had occurred, the focus now became identifying the responsible party, methodically, indisputably, and with the precision necessary to withstand scrutiny in a courtroom. Emotions were high, but investigators knew that precision, not passion, would bring justice. With Janine's remains recovered from the storage unit, the entire unit was processed as a primary crime scene. Nothing could be overlooked, even the smallest detail. Fibers, hair, chemical residue, digital trace from nearby devices. All of it mattered now. The contents of the unit were cataloged meticulously. Furniture with charred edges, duct tape, industrial trash bags, a melted plastic storage bin, all were logged and preserved for analysis. What became increasingly clear was that the body had not been stored there as an afterthought. Someone had taken steps, inept but intentional, to conceal a crime. The lab results came back in waves. Traces of bleach and accelerant were present on the floor of the unit and on the outside of the bag that had held the body. The burns on Janine's remains were inconsistent, confirming that fire had been used not to dispose of the body entirely, something unlikely to succeed in a closed unit, but to obscure physical evidence. However, despite the attempt, significant evidence survived. Among the fragments recovered was a piece of adhesive tape with a partial fingerprint. It was degraded by heat but usable. Forensics also isolated a strand of hair trapped in the seal of the trash bag, blonde, long, not matching Janine. DNA analysis was expedited, and while the sample was partial, it was strong enough to rule out numerous individuals previously considered irrelevant. At the same time, the security footage from the storage facility continued to provide valuable context. Surveillance video captured an individual entering the unit multiple times, always late at night, always staying for short durations. The behavior appeared rehearsed, like someone executing a plan over multiple stages. The way they moved, the clothes they wore, even the manner in which they walked, slightly hunched, glancing frequently over their shoulder, gave the impression not of confidence, but fear. It was the behavior of someone who knew what they were doing was criminal, but hoped they were doing it well enough to get away with it. While the person's face remained obscured, the vehicle they drove was not. Law enforcement was able to match the car to a known associate of Janine's, someone with access to the storage unit rental agreement, and whose digital footprint began to overlap more and more with key moments in the case. This is where technology filled the gaps that human recollection couldn't. Cell phone triangulation placed this individual's device near Janine's residence on the night she disappeared, then again at the storage facility, within the same time frame that security logs recorded entry. Additionally, purchase records from a nearby convenience store showed a transaction for items consistent with materials found at the crime scene: heavy-duty garbage bags, lighter fluid, disposable gloves, and cleaning supplies. The time of purchase was time-stamped within 24 hours of Janine's last known contact. This convergence of evidence, physical, digital, and circumstantial, was building towards something that could no longer be explained away as coincidence. Investigators began reconstructing the timeline hour by hour. Janine had last been seen leaving her apartment late in the evening. From there, the trail moved swiftly: a vehicle departing from her neighborhood, a visit to a secondary location, then silence. No more phone use, no social media, no financial activity, and soon after, a spike in activity from the suspect's side: purchases, movements, text messages, and storage facility access. But in building a case, detectives knew that facts must be corroborated with motive. Why would someone go to such lengths? Why now? And why Janine? The answer to that lay in court documents, personal history, and months of tension that had gone unreported but not unnoticed. Janine was engaged in an ongoing custody battle. Her desire to secure primary custody had escalated in the weeks prior. She had started documenting her concerns, compiling messages, and preparing to present a stronger case in family court. For someone on the other side of that dispute, her preparation could have been seen as a threat, the kind of threat that could unravel control, expose behavior, and potentially result in the loss of parental rights. When people feel power slipping away, some grasp for control, and in rare but devastating instances, that desperation turns lethal. Despite these mounting indicators, the individual under suspicion continued to maintain innocence. Their interviews were guarded. Their story never changed, but it also never aligned with the growing evidence. The timeline they provided contradicted phone records. Their explanation for their presence near Janine's apartment was vague. They denied ever visiting the storage facility, though security footage and access logs said otherwise. The walls were closing in. Investigators also turned to behavioral specialists to analyze the suspect's conduct throughout the process. Their conclusion was not legally binding, but it was compelling. The subject displayed classic signs of deflection, not denial. They avoided direct statements. They repeated certain phrases that seemed rehearsed, and when confronted with new evidence, they pivoted, rarely directly refuting, often redirecting. All of this mattered because the justice system demands more than suspicion. It demands a case built on undeniable connection, motive, means, and opportunity. And as Chapter 5 of this case closed, detectives had all four. What remained now was to move from investigation to prosecution. But even in this moment of progress, there remained a sense of gravity. Janine Camerata's life had been erased in a manner both violent and calculated. The work of the investigators was not simply about solving a crime. It was about restoring dignity, about bringing truth into the light after someone had worked so hard to smother it in darkness. As pressure mounted and evidence tightened its grip, the focus of the investigation transitioned from assembling proof to observing behavior. With the forensic trail pointing clearly toward a suspect, the next phase became psychological. Patterns would matter now: nonverbal cues, subtle shifts in narrative, pauses under pressure. This is the space where guilt often reveals itself before confession ever arrives. Interrogation in its purest form is not an act of confrontation. It's an exercise in patience. Detectives understand that most people don't confess out of fear. They break from fatigue. When every excuse has been countered and every lie exposed, Silence becomes harder to hold than truth. At first, the suspect clung to rehearsed answers. The script was short, mechanical. I wasn't there. I didn't see her. I don't know anything. Those phrases are common, simple denials with minimal emotional inflection. But investigators weren't looking for admissions yet. They were looking for inconsistencies, and inconsistencies were beginning to pile up. Phone records placed the suspect's device near Janine's residence in a window too close to ignore. They insisted they were somewhere else, but traffic cameras contradicted that claim. When presented with the footage, the response was a quiet nod, followed by a new explanation. Maybe I drove by, but I didn't stop. It was a shift, but a significant one. The story had changed. That's how unraveling begins, not with a breakdown, but with a revision. Each round of questioning introduced new contradictions. Purchase receipts for items linked to the body's disposal were met with confusion, then weak justification. I buy those things all the time, the suspect claimed. When asked for receipts from prior months showing similar purchases, there were none. The items had been bought once. The timing, immediately after Janine was last seen. These weren't coincidences. They were calculations gone wrong. Detectives presented a timeline, meticulously reconstructed using surveillance, digital data, and behavioral analysis. Janine left her home. Her phone stopped transmitting location data soon after. The suspect's phone, meanwhile, began moving across the city, eventually stopping near the storage facility, then returning to its starting point. All of it occurred within a 6-hour window. There were no gaps left to hide in. Psychological profiling had already noted signs of anxiety and compulsive self-protection in the suspect. Interviews revealed subtle tremors, repetitive phrasing, and a tendency to avoid eye contact when confronted with irrefutable details. The weight of the investigation was becoming visible, not in what was said, but in what couldn't be hidden anymore. The suspect began avoiding follow-up meetings. Legal representation was obtained, and communication shifted to indirect channels. This was expected. Rarely do full confessions arrive before charges are filed, but investigators had learned to listen to silence too. The refusal to speak further confirmed that the individual was aware of the case closing in. Meanwhile, a parallel thread was emerging. Another person, previously described only as a peripheral figure, began drawing interest. Phone records revealed late-night communication with the primary suspect during key moments. The tone of the messages was guarded, brief, nonspecific, but the frequency was unnatural. Dozens of texts spaced within minutes of one another were exchanged within hours of Janine's disappearance. The content wasn't explicit, but the context was damning. Investigators requested interviews with this second individual. At first, cooperation was limited, but when shown time-stamped phone logs, surveillance clips of their shared apartment complex, and matching data from GPS records, hesitation shifted into concern. The turning point came when the second individual was confronted with their own presence at the storage facility. While not involved in the rental agreement, they had accessed the premises alongside the primary suspect. Their name was not on the visitor log, but the cameras had captured them clearly. This wasn't just obstruction, it was complicity. Under mounting pressure, the second individual began to speak. Not a confession, but the beginning of something else, an admission of presence. They acknowledged being with the primary suspect during a stressful night, claiming they didn't know everything, only that things got out of control. It was vague, carefully worded, but in that vagueness lay truth. This was no longer the act of a single person. Now the case had taken a new shape. Janine hadn't just been murdered, she had been surrounded by people who either helped, enabled, or stood by as her life was taken and her body discarded. The silence that followed wasn't just one person's decision. It was a collective refusal to act. That realization weighed heavily on the investigative team. This wasn't just a matter of bringing a killer to justice. It was about confronting how easily some people can turn away from violence when it isn't happening to them. The bystander effect is well documented in psychology, but it takes on a haunting clarity when it plays out in real life, where silence becomes complicity and inaction becomes cover. The detectives had enough to move forward. Their suspect's timeline had been dismantled. The alibis were broken. The digital and physical evidence told a story more credible than any words offered in defense. The second individual's partial cooperation added further pressure. And the evidence stored in the forensic lab, the fingerprint, the hair, the fire accelerant, stood silently, but forcefully, in support of the truth. Arrest warrants were prepared. Janine's case was no longer just a mystery. It was now a prosecutable homicide, with defined suspects, established motive, and overwhelming proof. But even as legal momentum began to shift, the emotional reality remained sobering. A woman had died not only because someone acted violently, but because others failed to stop it. In law enforcement, closure is rarely clean. It comes with paper, not peace, but it is necessary. It gives the victims their voice back, even if too late. There is a specific silence that fills a room when an accomplice starts to bend under pressure. Not the silence of guilt, but of calculation. The kind where each pause means weighing risk, and every breath is measured against what could be lost. When law enforcement turned their full attention to the secondary individual connected to Janine Camarada's case, they were no longer searching blindly. They were guiding a collapse. This second figure, whose connection to the primary suspect had originally been described as casual or circumstantial, now stood in a far more precarious position. What had once seemed like peripheral involvement had begun to resemble full-fledged participation. The cameras didn't lie. The cell tower pings didn't lie. The digital breadcrumbs left behind were not just inconvenient, they were damning. In the days following Janine's disappearance, this person's behavior had followed a troubling pattern: inconsistent statements, evasive responses, and a notable reluctance to participate in interviews unless compelled. More telling than any statement, though, was their shared digital history. Investigators had mapped out dozens of text exchanges between the two suspects in the hours surrounding Janine's final known movements. The messages themselves lacked direct incrimination, but they were cloaked in tension. Short bursts of vague language, location-based check-ins, and one text in particular that simply read, "It's done." The implications were chilling. Under legal pressure and facing potential charges of obstruction, accessory after the fact, or worse, the second suspect agreed to a proffer session, a controlled environment where statements can be made with certain legal protections. It was here that the story began to fracture into something less controlled, less rehearsed. The individual admitted to helping move something, claimed they didn't know what it was at the time, and confessed to being afraid of the consequences of speaking out earlier. They described being told what to do, following instructions out of loyalty or fear. But loyalty doesn't erase footprints. During the same period, forensic technicians analyzed additional trace evidence recovered from the storage unit and the suspect's vehicle. Fibers from a specific blanket found wrapped partially around the remains were matched to fabric from the secondary suspect's apartment. The lab also identified a unique cleaning agent, rarely sold in mainstream stores, on both the floor of the storage unit and under the seat of the car used during the body's disposal. The agent had been purchased online from a shared account, one linked to both individuals. The case was no longer resting on circumstantial parallels. It was now a tightly woven mesh of physical fact, electronic trails, and corroborating statements. And yet, within the horror of these developments, something deeply human was beginning to emerge. Not just the gruesome mechanics of the crime, but the desperation, the psychological dependency, and the moral erosion that had allowed it to happen. In reviewing the suspect's history, detectives uncovered a power dynamic that had been long in play. The second individual, while involved, showed signs of manipulation and emotional entrapment. Friends described them as constantly under pressure, often isolated, and increasingly deferential to the dominant personality in the relationship. Their participation didn't absolve them of guilt, but it painted a clearer picture of the environment that birthed complicity. Still, from a prosecutorial standpoint, understanding motive and dynamic is separate from determining criminal responsibility. Assistance after a murder, especially in concealment and obstruction, is not a lesser offense. It is a critical component of the crime's success. And the justice system does not and cannot overlook that. After the proffer session, the second suspect was charged, not with murder, but with tampering with physical evidence, concealment of a human corpse, and hindering prosecution. Their bond was denied. They were booked and held, and almost immediately, the once solid alliance between the two suspects began to splinter. Jail calls, recorded and legally obtained, revealed tension, anger, and betrayal. Conversations laced with accusation and regret. No direct confessions were made, but the emotional tone shifted. What had once been solidarity eroded into fear and blame. The central suspect, now alone in isolation, began exhibiting signs of psychological stress, sleep disruption, agitation during interviews, a growing reluctance to communicate even with counsel. The final pivot came when an item believed to be Janine's was recovered during a secondary search of the vehicle. It had been missed during the initial sweep, a small locket, scorched but identifiable. Inside was a photograph of her children. It had been hers. It shouldn't have been there. Presented with this discovery, the second suspect broke. Their limited admission expanded into a fuller account. Janine, they said, had arrived at the apartment voluntarily, believing she was there to resolve a custody issue. An argument escalated. They described raised voices, movement toward the door, then a struggle. They claimed they didn't see the fatal blow but heard it, claimed they didn't help carry it out but didn't stop it either. It was not a clean confession, but it was enough. Investigators now had motive, fear of losing custody. They had means, a plan executed over several hours using materials intentionally purchased. They had opportunity, a controlled environment where the victim was isolated, vulnerable, and without immediate defense. They had a partial narrative from one suspect, physical evidence from both, and enough convergence across all points of investigation to sustain prosecution. But even as the legal framework solidified, those closest to Janine were still left navigating a more personal terrain. Her friends described mixed emotions, relief that arrests had been made, grief that it had taken so long, and an overwhelming sense of emptiness that justice, while necessary, would never be enough. One friend spoke of a moment, shortly before Janine disappeared, when she had laughed for the first time in weeks. They were eating takeout, sitting on a park bench, and Janine had smiled genuinely. That memory now was the final image they carried. Not the crime, not the headlines, just a friend trying to find peace. This is the human cost. It's what statistics don't show, what court documents can't capture. A life lost isn't just a case number. It's a ripple of loss that spreads through everyone left behind. Once arrests were made and the suspects were behind bars, a new kind of battle began, not one fought with fingerprints and surveillance footage, but with legal arguments, testimony, and strategy. The gears of justice, now in motion, would determine not just who would be held responsible for the death of Janine Camarata, but how her story would be preserved in public record. The prosecution moved swiftly, with a homicide investigation that had already drawn local media attention and sparked conversations across Staten Island about domestic abuse and system failures. The district attorney's office knew this would be more than just a courtroom drama. It would be a referendum on whether warning signs had been missed and whether justice could be achieved despite that. The primary suspect was charged with second-degree murder, concealment of a human corpse, tampering with physical evidence, and hindering prosecution. The secondary individual, the accomplice, was formally charged with criminal facilitation and evidence tampering. Both defendants entered not guilty pleas, but from the start, their legal strategies diverged. The primary defendant's legal team signaled an intent to fight every charge, to challenge every piece of evidence, to question the validity of witness testimony and the interpretation of forensic data. They argued that the case was circumstantial, that no one had witnessed the crime, that no clear confession existed, and that the forensic trail, while compelling, left room for alternative explanations. The defense leaned on doubt. Meanwhile, the accomplice, sensing the weight of the evidence and aware of their vulnerable position, moved to cooperate with prosecutors. A plea deal was negotiated, conditional on full, truthful testimony and assistance in reconstructing the events of Janine's final hours. This decision fractured the former alliance, creating an adversarial dynamic between two people who had once operated in quiet coordination. The trial began in a packed courtroom. Members of Janine's family filled the front rows, clutching photos, tissues, and each other's hands. Supporters from the school where she had worked were present as well. Teachers, former students, even parents. The proceedings were public, but to those inside, the gravity of what was being judged was deeply personal. The prosecution opened with clarity and restraint. They walked the jury through Janine's final days, her routine, her messages, her growing fear. They presented the digital timeline, her phone's last known activity, the suspect's movements, the convenience store purchases, the surveillance footage. They laid out the forensic findings, blunt force trauma, accelerants, DNA traces, and most notably, the locket found in the suspect's vehicle. Then came the testimony. Crime scene investigators detailed how Janine's body had been burned in an attempt to destroy evidence, but how the attempt had failed. Digital analysts explained the pattern of communication between the suspects before and after the crime. The medical examiner described the injuries, delivered with such force that it left no ambiguity about intent. But it was the accomplice's testimony that carried the most weight. On the stand, visibly shaken but resolute, the second defendant described the events of that night. They admitted to being present, to helping clean, to riding along to the storage unit. They claimed they had not delivered the fatal blow, but that they had helped cover it up out of fear, manipulation, and confusion. It wasn't absolution, but it was a direct link between the primary suspect and the crime. And then came the twist. During cross-examination, the accomplice revealed a detail that had not been previously made public. In the hours after Janine's death, the primary suspect allegedly attempted to draft a false message from Janine's phone, mimicking her tone, to make it appear as though she had left of her own volition. The message was never sent, but a digital remnant of it was later recovered from the phone's memory. The jury now had not just physical evidence and testimony, but a documented attempt to mislead investigators, an indication not only of guilt, but of premeditation. The defense tried to counter. They questioned the reliability of the accomplice, suggesting that they were testifying to save themselves. They challenged the chain of custody for the evidence. They implied that Janine's death could have been accidental, a result of an argument gone wrong, not a planned killing. But these arguments fell flat against the weight of the evidence and the calm certainty of the prosecution's case. Throughout the trial, Janine was present, not physically but through her story, her photos, her words preserved in texts, her smile in videos played during character witness statements. Her life, once silenced, had become the center of a courtroom determined to speak the truth. When the jury returned after several days of deliberation, their verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. The primary defendant was sentenced to 23 years to life in prison. The accomplice, as part of the plea deal and in recognition of their cooperation, received a sentence of 7 to 9 years. The courtroom, once tense with anticipation, fell into a quiet sob as the verdicts were read. But even then, no one called it closure. There were no victory speeches, no catharsis, just a long exhale, the weight of months, years, finally released, if only slightly. Janine's children, now in the care of extended family, would grow up knowing the truth, but also knowing the system responded. And that mattered. In the weeks that followed, local advocates pushed for increased protection for domestic abuse victims, and Janine's name became part of that movement. A fund was established to support her children. A mural was painted near her former school, a small but lasting reminder that she had lived, that she had mattered, and that silence would never again be mistaken for safety. The courtroom was empty now. The echo of the gavel had long since faded. The benches once filled with reporters, attorneys, and grieving loved ones stood silent, as if exhaling after months of unrelenting wait. The legal proceedings were over. The guilty had been named, the sentences handed down. On paper, justice had been served. But justice in a case like Janine Camerata's was never just about verdicts. It was about what remained, what changed, and what still hurt. In the weeks following the sentencing, Staten Island found itself in a strange place, suspended between relief and reckoning. Relief that the system had worked, that Janine's killers had not walked free, but also a reckoning with the questions no verdict could answer. Why had no one seen this coming? Why had her fear not been enough to warrant action? And how many others were still living in silence, afraid of what might happen if they spoke? Janine had been a mother, a teacher, a friend. She was not famous. Her life wasn't the subject of tabloid headlines until it was taken from her. But in the wake of her death, her story resonated deeply because it echoed something terrifyingly familiar: how easily warning signs are dismissed, how quickly control becomes danger, and how hard it can be to protect those most in need of protection. The community responded. Vigils were held in schoolyards and public parks. Former students brought handmade signs, teachers shared memories, and parents spoke about the need to take emotional abuse as seriously as physical threats. Local officials introduced measures to strengthen protections for victims of domestic violence, particularly those involved in custody disputes. At Janine's former school, her classroom remained untouched for days. Her desk, still stacked with lesson plans and student drawings, became a memorial. A single sunflower, her favorite, was placed in a vase by the window. Staff described the overwhelming quiet of her absence. For them, the loss wasn't just about justice. It was about losing someone who had shaped children's lives with patience and warmth, someone who made ordinary days feel safe. But perhaps the most profound response came from her family, especially those now raising her children. They chose not to shield the children from the truth, but to share it in measured, careful ways, ensuring that Janine's memory was not defined by her death, but by her love. They compiled photo albums, recorded stories, and built a sense of connection to a mother taken too soon. Therapists were brought in, support networks formed. It was not perfect, and the healing was far from linear, but it was active, it was honest, and that mattered. One day, during a family therapy session, Janine's eldest daughter, still too young to fully grasp the weight of what had happened, asked a question that silenced the room. Did Mommy try to fight? The answer came not in words, but in tears. Because yes, Janine had fought. Not just physically in her final moments, but through years of struggle to protect her children, to leave a situation that had long grown dangerous, to reclaim her independence. And that fight deserved to be remembered. From an investigative standpoint, the case became a training reference, discussed in law enforcement circles as a textbook example of digital forensics, behavioral profiling, and the intersection of domestic violence and homicide. But for those closest to it, it was never just a case. It was a life stolen. A void that could never truly be filled. The final chapter of the investigation didn't close in the courtroom. It closed in a quiet cemetery where Janine was laid to rest beneath a modest stone etched with her name and the words, "Forever loved, forever strong." The crowd was smaller than the one at the trial. There were no cameras, no press, just family, friends, and a few former students, now older, who had come to say goodbye. One left behind a note, folded and tucked beneath a flower. "You taught me how to read. I'll never forget that." It was the kind of legacy Janine would have wanted, not marked by headlines or court transcripts, but by kindness, resilience, and the memory of someone who mattered deeply to the people in her life. In the end, the story of Janine Camerata is not only about how she died, but how she lived, and how those who knew her refused to let that life be forgotten. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.